The morning mist hung heavy over Buckingham Palace as Captain James Morrison adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he believed would be another routine day of royal duties. 20 years of faithful service to the crown had taught him to expect the unexpected, but nothing could have prepared him for the events that would unfold before noon. Morrison had been handpicked by King Charles himself to serve as the Queen Consort's personal guard, a position that required absolute discretion and unwavering loyalty. His military background and impeccable record made him the perfect candidate for protecting someone as controversial and scrutinized as Camilla. The first sign that something was amiss came during the morning briefing. The usual chatter among the palace staff was replaced by hushed whispers and nervous glances. Morrison noticed how the household staff avoided eye contact when Queen Camilla passed through the corridors, their usual polite nods replaced by hurried curtsies and quick departures. Camilla herself seemed different that morning. Gone was her usual composed demeanor, replaced by a restless energy that made Morrison's instincts prickle with concern. She paced her private quarters like a caged animal, frequently checking her phone and glancing toward the king's wing of the palace with an expression Morrison couldn't quite decipher. The tension became palpable during the couple's scheduled morning meeting in the king's study. Morrison stood guard outside the heavy oak doors, but the raised voices within made it impossible to ignore the heated discussion taking place. Though he couldn't make out specific words, the tone was unmistakably that of an argument reaching its breaking point. Charles's voice carried through the door, firm and unyielding in a way Morrison had rarely heard during his years of service. The king's words were measured but carried the weight of absolute authority, each syllable delivered with the precision of a man who had made an irreversible decision. Camilla's responses were equally passionate, but held an undertone of desperation that made Morrison shift uncomfortably at his post. He had witnessed royal disagreements before, but this felt different, more personal, more final. When the doors finally opened, King Charles emerged first, his face a mask of royal composure that Morrison recognized as barely contained emotion. The monarch's eyes were cold as winter steel, and he walked past Morrison without acknowledgement, something completely out of character for the usually courteous king. Camilla followed moments later, her face flushed and her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a silk handkerchief. Morrison had never seen the Queen Consort in such a state of distress, and his protective instincts immediately went on high alert. She paused at the doorway, her gaze following her husband's retreating figure down the long corridor. For a moment, Morrison thought he saw genuine anguish in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by something harder, more determined. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious turmoil she was experiencing. "I need to speak with you privately. In my quarters, immediately." The walk to Camilla's private sitting room felt longer than usual, the silence between them heavy with unspoken tension. Morrison's training told him to remain professional and alert, but his human side couldn't help but feel concern for the woman he had sworn to protect. Once inside her quarters, Camilla dismissed the attending staff with a wave of her hand, ensuring complete privacy for whatever conversation was about to unfold. She moved to the large window overlooking the palace gardens, her back to Morrison as she gathered her thoughts. 20 years, Captain," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. 20 years I've devoted to this family, to this institution. I've endured the criticism, the comparisons, the constant scrutiny. I've tried to be the consort they needed, the queen they could accept." Morrison remained silent, sensing that she needed to voice her thoughts without interruption. In his years of service, he had learned that sometimes the most important part of protection was simply listening. "But it seems that no matter what I do, no matter how hard I try, it will never be enough," she continued, turning from the window to face him. "The king has made his position clear. There will be no forgiveness, no understanding, no recognition of the sacrifices I've made." The weight of her words settled in the room like a physical presence. Morrison could see the pain in her eyes, but also something else beginning to emerge, a resolve that spoke of decisions made in desperation. "I need you to understand, Captain, that what I'm about to ask of you goes beyond your normal duties," Camilla said, moving to her writing desk and retrieving an envelope sealed with wax. "This is not a request from your queen consort. This is a plea from a woman who has reached the end of her rope." Morrison's training screamed warnings, but his loyalty to the woman he had protected for so many years kept him rooted in place. He watched as she held the envelope, her knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. "There are things the public doesn't know, things that could change everything," she said, her eyes meeting his directly. "Secrets that have been buried to protect the crown, but also to protect those who would use them for their own gain." The implications of her words hit Morrison like a physical blow. In all his years of service, he had suspected that the royal family kept secrets, but he had never been directly confronted with evidence of their existence. "Ma'am, with respect, I'm not sure I'm the right person for whatever you're considering," Morrison said carefully, his military training warring with his personal loyalty. Camilla smiled sadly, an expression that transformed her face from that of a queen to that of a woman in genuine distress. "You're exactly the right person, Captain. You're one of the few people in this palace that I trust completely. More importantly, you're one of the few people who understands what it means to serve something greater than yourself, even when that service requires difficult choices." She extended the envelope toward him, and Morrison found himself staring at what looked like a perfectly innocent piece of correspondence. But the weight of the moment told him that whatever was inside would change everything. "This contains information that could secure my future." "But it could also destroy others," Camilla said, her voice now steady with resolve. "The king has made it clear that my past mistakes are unforgivable. He's planning changes that would effectively exile me from the life I've built here." Morrison felt the familiar weight of duty settling on his shoulders, but this time it was accompanied by uncertainty. His oath was to protect the queen consort, but what happened when protecting her might mean betraying the crown itself. "What exactly are you asking me to do, ma'am?" he asked, though part of him already knew he wouldn't like the answer. Camilla's eyes hardened with determination as she pressed the envelope into his hands. "I'm asking you to deliver this to someone who can ensure that the truth comes to light, someone who can make certain that if I'm to be cast aside, I won't go quietly into the night." The envelope felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in Morrison's hands. He looked at the elegant script on the front, noting an address he didn't recognize but sensing its importance. "Ma'am, if this contains what I think it does, delivering it could constitute treason," Morrison said quietly, his military honor warring with his personal loyalty. Camilla moved closer, placing her hand on his arm in a gesture that was both pleading and commanding. "Captain, in your 20 years of service, have I ever asked you to do anything that wasn't in service of the crown? Have I ever put you in a position that compromised your integrity?" Morrison had to admit that she hadn't. Queen Camilla had always been respectful of his position and had never asked him to cross ethical lines in his duties. "This isn't about revenge, Captain," she continued. "This is about survival. The king has decided that our marriage was a mistake, that I was a mistake. He's planning to announce changes that would effectively remove me from public life, strip me of my titles, and leave me with nothing after decades of service." The raw pain in her voice was undeniable, and Morrison felt his resolve wavering. He had seen firsthand how dedicated Camilla had been to her royal duties, how she had worked to win over a skeptical public, and how she had supported the king through his own challenges. "What's in the envelope, ma'am?" he asked, needing to understand the full scope of what she was asking. Camilla hesitated for a moment before answering. documentation of certain financial arrangements that were made during the transition period after Queen Elizabeth's death. Arrangements that, while legal, might be seen as inappropriate if viewed in the wrong light. Also, records of conversations between the king and certain government officials regarding my future role in the monarchy. Morrison felt his stomach drop. If what she was saying was true, the contents of the envelope could indeed change everything, potentially damaging the monarchy itself. "Ma'am, I have to ask, how did you come by this information?" Morrison said, his protective instincts now extending to the institution he served. "A queen consort learns to keep her own records, Captain," Camilla replied with a bitter smile. "When you're constantly under scrutiny, when every decision you make is questioned, you learn to document everything to protect yourself." The weight of the situation settled fully on Morrison's shoulders. He was being asked to choose between his loyalty to the woman he had sworn to protect and his duty to the crown she served. It was a choice no guard should ever have to make. "If I do this," Morrison said slowly, "there's no going back. For either of us." Camilla nodded, her expression grave. "I'm well aware of that, Captain. But sometimes, when all other options have been exhausted, we must choose between dignity and destruction. I refuse to be quietly discarded after everything I've given to this family." Morrison looked at the envelope in his hands one more time, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him. His next decision would change not only his own fate, but potentially the fate of the monarchy itself. "Who am I delivering this to, ma'am?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Camilla's smile was sad but determined as she gave him the answer that would set everything in motion. The address led Morrison to an elegant townhouse in Belgravia, one of London's most exclusive neighborhoods. The brass nameplate beside the door read Victoria Hartwell, Private Investigations, and Morrison felt his stomach tighten as he realized the full implications of his mission. Victoria Hartwell was no ordinary private investigator. She was known in certain circles as someone who specialized in high-profile cases involving the wealthy and powerful, someone who could navigate the treacherous waters of scandal and secrecy with surgical precision. Her client list was rumored to include politicians, celebrities, and business magnates who needed delicate situations handled with absolute discretion. Morrison stood on the doorstep for several minutes, the envelope burning in his inside pocket like a live coal. His military training had taught him to follow orders without question, but his conscience was screaming warnings about the path he was about to walk down. The door opened before he could ring the bell, revealing a woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything about him in a single glance. "Captain Morrison?" she said without preamble, stepping aside to allow him entry. "I've been expecting you." The fact that she knew his name without introduction sent another chill through Morrison. This had clearly been planned well in advance, which meant Camilla had been considering this course of action for some time. Hartwell's office was decorated with understated elegance, filled with antique furniture and expensive artwork that spoke of both success and discretion. She gestured for Morrison to take a seat in a leather chair across from her mahogany desk while she poured 2 cups of tea from a silver service. "You look troubled, Captain," she observed, settling into her own chair with the grace of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations. "This is understandable given the nature of your visit." Morrison accepted the tea but didn't drink it, his hands needing something to occupy them while his mind wrestled with the gravity of the situation. "Ma'am, I need to understand what I'm getting involved in here." Hartwell smiled, an expression that was both reassuring and calculating. "You're involved in protecting someone you've sworn to serve, Captain. Someone who finds herself in an impossible position through no fault of her own." The investigator's words were carefully chosen, Morrison realized. She was framing this as a continuation of his duties, rather than a betrayal of them. The Queen Consort has been planning for this possibility for quite some time, Hartwell continued, setting down her teacup with practiced precision. She's not a naive woman, Captain. She understands the precarious nature of her position and has taken steps to protect herself should the need arise. Morrison felt a mix of admiration and concern for Camilla's foresight. How long has she been preparing for this? Since the coronation, Hartwell replied without hesitation. Perhaps even before. A woman in her position learns to read the signs, to understand when the ground beneath her feet is shifting. The investigator moved to a filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder, placing it on the desk between them. Morrison could see that it was already quite substantial, suggesting that this was not a recent development. Your Queen Consort is a survivor, Captain, Hartwell said, opening the folder to reveal photographs, documents, and what appeared to be transcripts of conversations. She's endured decades of public scrutiny, personal attacks, and institutional resistance. She's not about to allow herself to be quietly disposed of now. Morrison looked at the materials spread before him, recognizing some faces in the photographs but not understanding the significance of what he was seeing. What exactly is the plan here? Hartwell's expression became more serious. That depends largely on the contents of what you've brought me. But I can tell you that we have multiple options available, ranging from private negotiation to public revelation. The choice will ultimately be the Queen Consort's, but she wanted to ensure that all possibilities were prepared for. Morrison reached into his jacket and withdrew the envelope, placing it on the desk with hands that were steadier than he felt. The moment it left his possession, he knew there would be no turning back. Hartwell opened the envelope with the care of someone handling volatile materials. As she read through the contents, her eyebrows rose slightly, and Morrison caught glimpses of official letterheads and what appeared to be bank statements. "This is quite comprehensive," she murmured, more to herself than to Morrison. "Financial records, correspondence, meeting notes. Your Queen Consort has been very thorough indeed." Morrison watched as the investigator photographed each document with professional efficiency, creating copies that would ensure the information's preservation regardless of what happened to the originals. "Can you tell me what we're dealing with here?" Morrison asked, his need to understand the situation outweighing his discretion. Hartwell looked up from her work, considering her words carefully. "What you've brought me documents a pattern of financial arrangements and political maneuvering that, while not illegal, could be extremely embarrassing if made public. More importantly, it provides evidence of the king's intentions regarding the Queen Consort's future role." She held up one particular document that Morrison could see bore the royal seal. "This appears to be a draft announcement outlining changes to the Queen Consort's titles and duties, changes that would effectively remove her from public life while maintaining the facade of her position." Morrison felt anger rising in his chest on Camilla's behalf. After everything she had done to rehabilitate her image and serve the crown faithfully, the idea that she would be quietly sidelined seemed genuinely unfair. "There's also documentation of conversations between the king and certain government officials about the legal aspects of such changes," Hartwell continued. "It appears that this has been in planning for several months." The betrayal implicit in such long-term planning struck Morrison forcefully. While Camilla had been faithfully performing her duties, her husband had apparently been orchestrating her removal from them. "What happens next?" Morrison asked, dreading the answer. Hartwell returned the documents to their envelope and locked them in her safe before responding. "Now we wait. The Queen Consort will need to decide how she wants to proceed. She has several options available to her." The investigator moved to the window, looking out at the busy London street below. She could use this information to negotiate a more favorable arrangement with the king. The threat of revelation might encourage him to reconsider his plans. Morrison could see the logic in that approach. but something told him that Camilla was beyond the point of negotiation. Alternatively, Hartwell continued, she could choose to make selected portions of this information public, creating pressure for a more equitable resolution. The media would be very interested in stories about internal royal conflicts. The idea of royal family drama being played out in the tabloids made Morrison uncomfortable, but he had to admit it would be effective. And the third option? He asked, though he was beginning to suspect what it might be. Hartwell turned back to face him, her expression grave. Complete disclosure. Everything made public, every document released, every conversation revealed, it would be nuclear in its impact, potentially damaging the monarchy itself. The weight of that possibility settled on Morrison like a physical burden. The idea that his actions might contribute to damaging the institution he had served his entire career was almost unbearable. Surely she wouldn't go that far, he said, more hoping than believing. Hartwell's smile was sad but knowing. A woman scorned is dangerous enough, Captain. A queen scorned, with documentation to support her grievances, could bring down governments. Morrison spent the next hour learning about the intricate network that Hartwell had built around Camilla's situation. There were journalists prepared to write stories, lawyers ready to file injunctions, and even members of Parliament who could ask uncomfortable questions in the House of Commons. The scope of the preparation was breathtaking and spoke to a level of strategic thinking that Morrison had never suspected from the woman he had been protecting. Camilla had not been simply enduring her difficulties, she had been preparing for war. Your role in this, Captain, will depend on what the Queen Consort decides, Hartwell explained as their meeting drew to a close. But I want you to understand that you've done nothing wrong here. You've protected someone under your care from a threat to her well-being. Morrison wasn't entirely convinced, but he appreciated the reassurance. His entire career had been built on clear lines of duty and authority, and this situation had blurred all of those lines beyond recognition. When will I know what she's decided? He asked. Hartwell handed him a business card with only a phone number written on it. She'll be making her decision tonight. You'll receive a call tomorrow morning with instructions. Morrison took the card, noting that his hand was trembling slightly. 24 hours to wait and worry about the consequences of his actions. 24 hours to wonder if he had just helped destroy everything he had sworn to protect. As he left the townhouse and walked back toward his car, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The streets of London suddenly felt different, as if the very air around him was charged with potential consequences. His phone buzzed with a text message from Camilla. Thank you, Captain. I won't forget your loyalty. Morrison stared at the message for a long time, wondering if that loyalty would ultimately prove to be his salvation or his destruction. The die had been cast, and now all he could do was wait to see how it would land. The drive back to Buckingham Palace felt like a journey through a minefield, every familiar landmark now seeming to carry hidden significance. Morrison realized that regardless of what Camilla decided to do with the information he had delivered, his life would never be the same. The call came at exactly 7 o'clock the next morning, just as Morrison was finishing his morning coffee in his modest flat near the palace. The voice on the other end was Hartwell's, crisp and professional despite the early hour. The Queen Consort has made her decision, Captain, she said without preamble. She wants to proceed with option 2, selected disclosure through carefully chosen media contacts. Morrison felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. It wasn't the nuclear option, but it was still going to create massive shockwaves throughout the royal establishment. What does that mean for me? It means you need to maintain your normal routine while being prepared for significant changes in the coming days, Hartwell replied. The Queen Consort will need your continued protection and support as this unfolds. Morrison arrived at the palace an hour later to find an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos. Palace staff moved through the corridors with nervous energy, and he noticed several high-ranking officials arriving for unscheduled meetings. Something had already begun to happen. He found Camilla in her private study, sitting calmly at her writing desk as if nothing unusual was occurring. She looked up as he entered, and Morrison was struck by how different she appeared. Gone was yesterday's anguish and uncertainty, replaced by a steely determination that transformed her entire bearing. "Good morning, Captain," she said, her voice carrying an authority that seemed stronger than before. "I trust you slept well?" Morrison almost smiled at the absurdity of the question. "As well as could be expected under the circumstances, ma'am." Camilla gestured for him to close the door and take a seat. "I want you to know that I've given considerable thought to the path we're embarking upon. This isn't a decision made in anger or spite, but one made out of necessity." She handed him a newspaper that Morrison hadn't seen yet, the morning edition of the Times. The headline made his blood run cold: "Royal Marriage in Crisis. Questions raised about Queen Consort's future role." "The first article was published this morning," Camilla explained with satisfaction. "Carefully sourced, thoroughly researched, and absolutely devastating in its implications." Morrison scanned the article, noting how skillfully it had been written. It didn't make any direct accusations, but raised pointed questions about recent changes in royal protocol and the Queen Consort's notably reduced public appearances. Most damaging of all, it quoted anonymous palace sources expressing concern about the stability of the royal marriage. "This is just the beginning," Camilla continued, taking the newspaper back and setting it aside. "Over the next several days, additional revelations will emerge. Financial questions, protocol changes, recorded conversations, each one carefully calibrated to apply maximum pressure." Morrison could see the strategy clearly now. Rather than one massive revelation that could be dismissed or contained, this was designed as a sustained campaign that would build momentum over time. "Ma'am, have you considered what this might do to the monarchy as an institution?" Morrison asked, his concern for the bigger picture overriding his personal loyalties. Camilla's expression hardened slightly. "The monarchy has survived far worse scandals than this, Captain. It survived Edward VIII's abdication, Diana's death, Andrew's controversies. It will survive this as well, but with a clearer understanding of the consequences of betrayal." Before Morrison could respond, there was a sharp knock on the door. Camilla's private secretary entered with obvious agitation, announcing that the king had requested an immediate meeting with the Queen Consort in his study. Morrison accompanied Camilla through the palace corridors, noting how the usual bustle of royal life had taken on an undercurrent of tension. Staff members who normally bustled about their duties now moved with nervous glances and hushed conversations. The king's study felt different as they approached, as if the very air around it was charged with potential conflict. Morrison took his position outside the door, but unlike yesterday, the conversation within was conducted in controlled, measured tones that were somehow more ominous than the heated argument he had witnessed before. Charles's voice carried through the heavy oak, cold and formal in a way that suggested the gloves had finally come off. Morrison caught fragments of phrases: unacceptable betrayal, damage to the crown, and most chillingly, consequences will be severe. Camilla's responses were equally controlled, but carried an undertone of steel that Morrison had never heard before. Her words were carefully chosen and delivered with the precision of someone who knew exactly what cards she held and how she intended to play them. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours, far longer than their previous confrontation. When the doors finally opened, both participants emerged with expressions of cold civility that was more frightening than open hostility. King Charles walked past Morrison without acknowledgement, his face a mask of royal composure that barely concealed seething anger. Morrison had served the royal family long enough to recognize when diplomatic facades were hiding genuine fury. Camilla followed shortly after, her own expression unreadable, but her posture suggesting victory rather than defeat. She nodded to Morrison and walked calmly back toward her quarters, her pace measured and deliberate. "How did it go, ma'am?" Morrison asked once they were safely behind closed doors. Camilla moved to her window, looking out at the gardens where tourists and photographers were already gathering in unusual numbers. "The king has presented me with an ultimatum. I have 48 hours to withdraw all cooperation with any media inquiries and to publicly deny any marriage difficulties. In return, he'll consider maintaining my current role and titles." Morrison felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this could still be resolved without further damage to anyone involved. "And if you refuse?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Camilla's smile was cold as winter. "Then I will be formally separated from all royal duties, stripped of my titles, and effectively exiled from the life I've built here. He believes that cutting off my access to palace resources and royal status will leave me powerless to continue." The king had clearly underestimated his wife's preparation and resolve. Morrison could see that this ultimatum had been anticipated and planned for. "What's your response going to be, ma'am?" Camilla turned from the window, and Morrison saw in her eyes the look of someone who had crossed a bridge and burned it behind her. "My response, Captain, was delivered this morning along with the newspaper article. The king will discover that his ultimatum came approximately 12 hours too late." Morrison's phone buzzed with a text message, and he glanced at it to see a news alert. The headline made his stomach drop. "Financial questions surround royal household. Queen consort's access to crown resources under scrutiny." "The second wave," Camilla explained, noting his expression. "This one focuses on the financial arrangements that were made during the transition period after the late Queen's death. Perfectly legal arrangements, but ones that might raise eyebrows if examined too closely." Morrison realized that Camilla wasn't just fighting for her position. She was fighting for her survival in a world where reputation and public perception were everything. The king's ultimatum had forced her hand, but she had clearly been ready for this moment. "Ma'am, what happens to those of us who serve you when this is all over?" Morrison asked, thinking about the dozens of staff members whose careers were now tied to whatever outcome emerged from this conflict. Camilla's expression softened slightly, showing the first genuine emotion Morrison had seen from her all morning. "That's precisely why I'm fighting this way, Captain. It's not just my future at stake. It's the future of everyone who has served faithfully and deserves better than to be discarded as collateral damage." The remainder of the day passed in a surreal atmosphere of controlled crisis. Palace officials moved through the corridors with grim determination, while media vans began assembling outside the gates in numbers not seen since major royal events. Morrison's duties continued as normal, but every routine task felt charged with significance. He escorted Camilla to scheduled meetings that proceeded with forced normalcy, while everyone involved knew that the ground beneath their feet was shifting fundamentally. By evening, 3 more articles had appeared in various publications, each one revealing additional details about the royal marriage crisis and raising new questions about the handling of royal affairs. The strategy was working perfectly, creating a media firestorm that would be impossible to contain or dismiss. Morrison's final duty of the day was escorting Camilla to what was scheduled as a private dinner in her quarters. But as they approached her dining room, he could see that this was no ordinary meal. Victoria Hartwell was there, along with 2 people Morrison didn't recognize, but who clearly weren't palace staff. "Captain, I'd like you to meet Sarah Chen and David Matthews," Camilla said as they entered. "Ms. Chen is a constitutional lawyer, and Mr. Matthews represents my personal interests in media matters." Morrison realized he was looking at Camilla's war council, the team that had been assembled to guide her through the battle ahead. The casual dinner was actually a strategy session for the next phase of operations. The king's people will be working through the night to develop their response strategy, Hartwell explained as they took their seats. We need to be prepared for whatever countermeasures they might deploy. Matthews spread several newspapers across the table, showing headlines from publications around the world. The story had already gone international, with coverage in American, European, and Commonwealth media. The global interest is intense, he reported. Every major outlet wants exclusive access to the full story. Chen leaned forward with legal documents in hand. We need to discuss the formal protections available to you. The king cannot simply strip your titles without proper legal process, and any attempt to do so could be challenged in court. Morrison listened to the conversation with growing amazement at the sophistication of the operation that had been put in place. This wasn't a desperate gamble by a wounded woman. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign by a team of professionals. The third wave launches tomorrow morning, Hartwell announced. This one will include recorded conversations that demonstrate the premeditated nature of the king's plans. After that, we move to the final phase. Camilla looked around the table at her assembled team with satisfaction. Gentlemen, lady, we've crossed the Rubicon. There's no turning back now for any of us. The king wanted to end this marriage quietly and dispose of me discreetly. Instead, he's going to discover that some battles, once begun, must be fought to their conclusion. Morrison realized that his role in delivering that first envelope had been just the opening move in a much larger game. As he looked at the determined faces around the table, he understood that Camilla had never intended to go quietly into exile. The queen consort had declared war on the crown itself, and Morrison found himself wondering who would still be standing when the dust finally settled. One thing was certain. The monarchy would never be the same after this battle was finished. As the evening strategy session continued, Morrison stood guard, knowing that tomorrow would bring revelations that would shake the very foundations of the institution he had sworn to protect. But perhaps, he thought, some foundations needed to be shaken to remain strong. As the palace gates came into view, Morrison steeled himself for what was likely to be the longest night of his career. Tomorrow would bring answers, consequences, and quite possibly the end of everything he had worked to build. But tonight, he would stand guard one more time, protecting a woman who had trusted him with everything, even as she prepared to potentially destroy them all.